Elizabeth Boyle is a medieval historian, first and foremost, and now a celebrated author from her first book, Fierce Appetites, a memoir. Just want to read to you a little bit from the back of the book. Hilary Mantel, not a bad quote to have on the back of your book, said, "It's an eloquent plea for the value of curiosity and the life of the mind, standing up the robustness of scholarship against the frailty of individuals, the resilience of myth against brittle daily preoccupations. It's an agile story, irreverent, capacious, and constantly surprising, like nothing else you will read." And it touches on so many themes from Elizabeth's own life and also through the prism of medieval literature. It's based around some sort of milestone moments in your life, the death of her father, firstly, the end of a relationship, turning 40, and all of this against the backdrop of lockdown as well. And then looking at, I suppose, how medieval literature resonated through all of that. So she's going to begin today with the opening of the book, the first couple of pages, and a little reading.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for having me. The last words my father said to me were Happy New Year. By the evening of New Year's Day, he was back in hospital, drowning in his own fluids. The doctors recommended ceasing all treatment, and he was moved into a side room to begin dying. His only surviving brother came to say goodbye, baffled by the injustice of the situation, that he, the eldest child, should be the last one standing, his 4 younger siblings all gone before him. An Indian priest came to administer the last rites. My youngest brother by the same father, unbaptized, the son of my Scottish Protestant stepmother, stood silently, uncomprehending, while I mouthed the responses to the Catholic sacrament with no belief other than that this is what our father would have wanted. We went home to sleep. My stepmother took the night shift, whispering memories to her unresponsive husband, playing songs to him on her phone. Around 6 a.m, we got the call. The time was near. My brother and I got into the car, and he drove the journey along dark roads to the hospital. I tried to think of some profound life advice that I might have received from my father. He had once suggested that I spice up a stale relationship by having an affair, but that didn't seem like a suitably solemn lesson, although I had indeed followed the advice at the time. And it didn't help. Nothing else came to mind. My brother and I arrived at the hospital and kissed our father's forehead. At 8 a.m, we realized the coffee shop had opened, and we slipped out to buy oversized Americanos. My brother poured 17 sachets of sugar into his black coffee. I muttered to him, "If Dad dies while you're adding all these fucking sugars, I will never speak to you again." We walked back to the ward, and Dad had died, with my stepmom at his side, while we were adding endless sugar to coffee. And that somehow seemed right, and we hugged and cried, and I left the room to tell a nurse that Dad was gone. One medieval Irish poet, speaking of grief, wrote, "My heart is a clot of blood." My heart was a clot of blood as I sat in the hospital coffee shop, sending messages, receiving condolences, waiting for my eldest brother by the same father and mother and his daughter to arrive at the hospital, and for my father's body to be prepared in the mortuary. Sometime in the middle of the 8th century, the poet Slavak, son of Cuvreton, wrote of the crucifixion that the whole world grew dark, the land shook under gloom at the death of noble Jesus, great rocks broke asunder. A stream of blood gushed forth, too severe, so that the skin of every tree became red. There was gore on the surfaces of the world, in the treetops of every great forest. It was fitting for God's elements, beautiful sea, beautiful sky, this earth, that they should change their aspect when keening their hero. I stepped outside for a while and saw that the January sky was very blue, but nothing changed. The world did not grow dark. There was no gore in the treetops. The elements did not shake. The world kept turning, but my heart was a clot of blood.
So I think even if we only spoke about the first page or two of the book, there's already so much to unpack there. I might be ditching the rest of my questions. It's a very raw opening and it takes us right in, but it also covers a multitude. And I suppose the main thing is one of probably the worst nights of your life, the worst starts to the days. How does it feel having to reread that at literary festivals in front of a crowd of people? Did you, you couldn't have predicted when you were writing it that you'd have to relive that over and over again in a setting like this?
It's been surprisingly therapeutic, actually. It's been a way to write through the grief and read through the grief, and it's been surprisingly helpful, I think, and also an awareness that I think my dad would be quite proud of what I wrote. Not all of it, maybe. Sorry, Dad, but most of it he'd be quite proud. So it's been quite surprisingly cathartic in a way to write it down and record it in words, how it felt at that time. Yeah.
You say there that it's a way to read through the grief, and that beautiful piece of medieval poetry that you quoted in it certainly seems to really catch a lot of the emotions that you're feeling. I'm presuming that a lot of your reading is medieval literature, more so than contemporary, perhaps. But even comparing that with reading contemporary literature, how do you find medieval literature resonates with you or describes things in a way that maybe contemporary doesn't?
Well, I think medieval literature is my job. That's what I read day in, day out, and have done for the past 25 years. Whereas contemporary literature is what I read in the evenings at bed, and it's what I enjoy reading. I read a lot of contemporary literature. But I think having spent all these decades reading medieval literature, studying it, writing about it, publishing on it, has in a way conditioned how I see the world. And when things happen on the news, I sometimes think of a medieval precursor, or if something happens to me, I sometimes think of a medieval text. And that's in a way something that I wanted to really convey with the book, is that I've been sort of conditioned to see my whole world through these medievalist eyes, and so I'm always spotting things that do seem to resonate with past experiences or past events or past texts. And the Blufffuck poem really did spring into my mind when I was standing outside that hospital. But then, as I go on to say in subsequent pages, when I was grieving, I went and read I started reading autobiographies and memoirs and reading about other people's contemporary lives as well. So it's not that I'm just stuck in a medieval hole or something, but that the two play against each other, the modern and the medieval, the present and the past, always in interplay, I think.
One question I wanted to ask you, you go through a lot of different characters from medieval literature in the book, and I want to come back to this as well, and how you tell maybe stories about them that in popular culture we don't see them the way you really see them when you study them. But do you see a bit of yourself in any of the characters from medieval literature, and if so, who?
Well, I do, yeah. I write that I kind of see a little bit of myself in there's one text that I write about the Old English life of Mary of Egypt, who describes herself as being absolutely sort of driven by appetites. The appetites of the title, sexual appetites and lust, and that she's sort of talks about how in her youth she used to desire men running into her arms, and has been really driven by passion in the way that she was. I absolutely can identify with. But then she has a religious conversion and becomes an ascetic nun, so there my identity with her stops.
And there your paths diverge. And I think one thing that really struck me in the book, in a certain part, it was around page 32, I think, if you want to look at what I'm referencing here, is that you were talking about the life of actual nuns, I think, but they would have been educated. But it struck me that I suppose women in medieval times had probably more power, some of them, or more education than we would think necessarily. Their status was more there was a lot more to them that was more interesting.
It's a lot more complex than often we think. I mean, so I'm dealing mostly with medieval Ireland through the book. There's a bit about Wales and England as well. And in medieval Ireland, you've got the fundamental fact that under early Irish law, a woman was worth half of a man. Okay, that's a fundamental. Your honour price is half that of a man. and you don't have the same rights to make a contract, for example, or own property. But on the other hand, the church was a way in for women to get an education, and you could, say the abbess of Kildare, for example, would have been one of the most politically important people on the island, controlling one of the largest ecclesiastical estates on the island as well. So there's a nice bit where St. Patrick himself in his own writings writes that women's fathers don't like them converting to Christianity because the fathers are losing a resource, the daughter, which can be given in marriage to forge an alliance or to, sort of cement political relationships. But the women could go into the church and have a monastic education, quite a high degree of education, and potentially a fairly significant amount of economic power if they end up as head of one of the big female monastic communities. So, yeah, it's complicated.
And directly after that, actually, in the book, one of the most famous characters in Irish history, Queen Maeve, you've given her a trouncing, which I love this line. Maeve is an infuriatingly idiotic bitch. Discuss. So there are two versions of the story known as Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, that survive in medieval, early 11th and 12th century manuscripts. And in both, these are the two earliest surviving versions, and in both versions, Maeve, or Mev, the name is pronounced in Old Irish, but Maeve is, the whole point of the story is to show the danger of allowing a woman to have military power, for allowing a woman to lead an army on a futile quest that results in massive bloodshed and the death of the bull that they're going after in the first place, okay? And she's very negatively depicted as not listening to good and sound military advice and taking bad decisions in the field. But also there's, sort of physical humour, like she menstruates at the worst possible moment when they're about to go into battle and all this kind of stuff. So the whole thing is about not following women in battle. Now, people tend to assume, on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, that there was some earlier or pre-existing version of the time where Maeve was more favourably portrayed. And that, I think the attitude seems to be, these dastardly monks came along and made it all misogynistic and turned her into a bat. But there must have been a goddess Maeve. There must have been a great hero Maeve in some pre-written past, before we have anything. But there's no evidence for that. That's an assumption. That's an assumption that isn't borne out by the textual evidence. The textual evidence is all that you have is this 11th century version that's compiled from the earliest strata of it linguistically at 8th century. And then you've got a 12th century version where she's even worse. But she's never positively portrayed. And there's a separate death tale of Maeve where she's killed by a giant block of cheese. So it's... What a way to go.
If you got to go, cheese is a good way to go. But she's not, in the earliest literature, she's not in any way held up as a positive figure or venerated. But there tends to be a wish to do feminist readings of the time to make her into this sort of heroic war leader or whatever, but that's not actually how she's portrayed in the medieval texts themselves. So.
I suppose in terms of this linking to issues that you've brought up around your personal life in the book, there's a lot about your family and your upbringing, and you've the line then about Maeve being portrayed as a bad mother who was willing to give her daughter away, and I suppose there's a link there to where your mother actually left you as a child. Was that something that resonated with the Maeve story as well?
Yeah, to some extent, although I think what resonated more, so the chapter on kind of motherhood and families, my mother gave me up when I was just before my 3rd birthday, and but the purpose of the chapter is, I think, to show that like chosen families or families that are constructed from all sorts of bits and pieces, foster families, adopted families, step families, have existed through time. And I think the bit that resonated more with me was the Isagan poem that I write about, where you have the image of nuns that are having to foster unwanted children, and which was a function of the church in the Middle Ages. But they imagine that the babies are like Christ and they're breastfeeding or nursing the infant Jesus. And for me, that image of sort of chosen motherhood resonated more because I was very lucky to have a very awesome stepmom who sort of chose to be my mum. And so I wanted to look at the different ways that families have been configured in the past and how, the idea of the nuclear family, the mum, dad and 2 kids or whatever, is a very modern one. And the institution of fosterage was incredibly important in early medieval Ireland. Young people would be fostered out to other families, again, to cement political alliances, but also to learn trades or to become a warrior or whatever. So to me, the resonance is between having a sort of patched together, slightly broken but kind of, misshapen family seems to have a lot of resonances in the past where families also came in all kinds of shapes and sizes, So for me, it was, that positive image of chosen families, I think,
You were also writing an academic text while you were writing this book, am I correct? So it was quite a shift of gear mentally to move between those two. And I think it's probably fair to say you found this book very cathartic to write. Tell me a little bit about those kind of differing processes.
Yeah, you probably don't want to read the other one. I was writing a book, it's called History and Salvation in Medieval Ireland, and it's an academic study of Middle Irish texts, so 10th through to 12th century texts, written mostly in Irish, some in Latin, that talk about Ireland's conception of Jerusalem and Babylon and the Holy Land and biblical topographies and so on. And it took me 7 years to do the research and write it, and footnotes and bibliographies and citing all the people I needed to cite, and this took me 7 months to write because it was just, there are no footnotes, there's no references, it just kind of poured out of me, and it was, the 2 experiences were very different, and but writing the History and Salvation book, that's my job, that's what I'm paid to do research into medieval Irish culture, and this was just more of a labour of love. So,
I think we might move on to the second reading you wanted to do now. So this is when Elizabeth is moving from the UK over to Ireland to take up her dream job at Maynooth University, and it's a little bit about the journey over here.
Yeah, and it's a little bit about what was happening in June 2020 when I was writing this book as well. So when I moved from Cambridge to Dublin in 2013, I got a lift in the van with the vegan, raw food eating Latvian guy that the removals company had sent to move my stuff. On the way to Holyhead to catch the ferry, I asked him to stop by the side of a road in northeast Wales so that we could traipse across a field to see the Pillar of Eliseg. This stone pillar, originally the base of a great inscribed cross, was erected in the first half of the 9th century by a king of Powys named Connnor ap Cadach in honour of his great-grandfather Eliseg ap Gwilog. The site of the pillar has suffered great violence over the centuries, not least by antiquarian excavators in the 17th and 18th centuries trying to get at the Bronze Age burials that lie beneath. The Latin inscription on the pillar is badly weathered and illegible now, but from 17th century transcriptions, we know that it invoked Eliseg's military victories against the English and asked people to pray for Eliseg's soul. It also asked for God's blessing on Connnor, who had commissioned the statue, on his household and the kingdom of Powys. I tried to explain the significance of it all to the removals guy, but he was visibly unimpressed by something that is now, let's face it, just a broken stump in a field. And he took vengeance for my time-wasting diversion by playing Hare Krishna CDs on the van stereo all the way to Holyhead. I tried to drown out the incessant chanting with thoughts about Connnor, this powerful king who ruled his kingdom in northeast Wales for more than 40 years. In 854, he travelled to Rome, where he died. Perhaps it was an end-of-life pilgrimage to expiate the sins of his violent royal career, or perhaps the international journey was a public display of his political status. Perhaps it was a bit of both, just as the Pillar of Eliseg is a statement of power and of prayer. Despite the irreparable damage done to the pillar over the centuries by forces both human and natural, neither Connnor nor Eliseg have been forgotten. June sees the removal and effacing of a number of statues in the UK and in the United States by Black Lives Matter protesters. Monuments to slave traders, Confederate soldiers, people whose wealth and reputations were built on the exploitation and suffering of others. A statue of the brutal King Leopold II is pulled down in Belgium. June also sees a chorus of voices claiming that removing a statue from a public square equates to an erasure of history, as though the world had instantly forgotten who Lenin was when his statues tumbled with the fall of communism. Back in January, when I was drowning in grief for my father, I told you a story about another father and his own dangerously disproportionate response to grief. According to the author of the Book of Wisdom, he had commissioned an artist to build a statue in the likeness of his dead son. The artist created something so true to life that people began to worship it, and thus was idolatry unleashed on the world. The author of this story, and the medieval Irish poet who later adapted it into verse, intended it to be a warning of the risks of memorializing someone in bronze or stone, the danger that instead of simply remembering them, we might venerate them. A statue tells us a lot about those who erect it, those who fund its creation and provide space for it, a public square perhaps, or a park or the side of a building. A statue says, we admire this person, you should admire this person. This person has qualities that we wish to magnify through commemoration. This person embodies our communal identity. In many societies and many eras, people have regarded military success or the amassing of great wealth as markers of moral virtue. People conquered the lands of others and became rich because God or the gods favoured them. So Connnor wanted people to remember Elisev because of his great military victories, his defence of Powys against English incursions. However, public statues are not history. They are an inheritance that we can choose to accept or reject. We can tear statues down and make new ones, just as we can refashion our society with different values. Instead of battles and gold, we can commemorate justice and peace. So far from seeing history as being erased, as I watched the news footage of the statue of slave trader Edward Colston getting pushed into Bristol Harbour, I knew that it was being written.
Does that make you, when you see something like that, look back at maybe texts you might have studied 20 years ago and read them with fresh eyes and think about that kind of what might have happened to change people's perceptions or views on that text in between?
Absolutely, yeah. I think our changing circumstances change the way that we read the sources of the past. And I think when I was an undergraduate, it was still the kind of pretty much dominated by the kind of great man school of history and, you know, the kind of battles, kings, that kind of thing. And now you can look at the same sources, the same resources that we have from the past and read them differently, looking for other people's stories, you know, looking for women's stories, looking for stories of immigration and integration, or looking for stories of marginalized voices or whatever. So yeah, we're always reading, in a way, the same sources from the past, but reading them differently to uncover new voices. And so I think it's people sometimes use the term revisionist as an insult, that people think history. I don't understand why that's supposed to be insulting, because, you know, in my opinion, history is always in the process of being revised. It's always in the process of being re-understood and rewritten, depending on our circumstances and our awareness and attentiveness to other voices that haven't necessarily been heard before. So, yeah, you can read the same sources again and again and read them differently in every age, I think.
Yeah. Even for fiction or literary fans, I suppose, looking at something like Deanna Grief's Ghost in the Throat and putting a woman's voice into the Queen of Artilleria story is a great example of that people might be really familiar with from the last couple of years. I suppose another question kind of related to that I wanted to ask you was, you wrote a lot of this book kind of around lockdown, right? So, and a lot of it is deeply personal to you and the way you were reading medieval texts to resonate within your own life. If you wrote this book again today, do you think it would be a very different book now?
Probably it would. At one reading I did, someone in the audience suggested I should do one a decade of these and just see how different it was every 10 years, but in that sense, because, it was, there's a lot about travel and how much people travelled in the Middle Ages, and then inability to travel once we sort of get into lockdown. And so I've always been intrigued by inclusi, the people that had themselves walled into cells. And I write a little bit about, there's one Irishman, Mariana Scotus, who travelled all the way to, what's now Germany, only to be walled into a cell in a church in Mainz for 10 years, just to devote his life to prayer and contemplation. So I think the interest in the book in movement and trappedness and that kind of thing is probably a very 2020 product. And if I were to write it again this year, I'd then be looking at different things, I think, yeah.
Interesting you mentioned travel there. You write about in the book how you had a terrible fear of flying, and were back and forth to the UK constantly on the ferry for a long time until you conquered that fear. Does that change you, overcoming a fear so big in how you approach everything in life, that now you've conquered one fear, you can conquer others?
Yeah, I think so. I remember, for some random reason, I ended up giving a conference paper at a conference in Svalbard, which is, the most northerly inhabited place on Earth. And it was in the middle of the polar night, so it was completely dark 24 hours a day. And I got an opportunity to go to drive a dog sled. And that was something I never would do. I was crippled with it. Flying was just one fraction of all of these kind of anxieties that assaulted me for this period when I was sort of, I suppose, just starting my job here. And I knew when I was on that dog sled, ploughing through the Arctic tundra, that I had overcome these fears. I was like, okay, it doesn't get much better than this. But I was for a period of time really crippled by anxieties and the flying, so I just relentlessly back and forwards on the sail and rail on the ferry. But something kind of a bit medieval about taking the boat instead of a plane, I suppose.
Yeah, it's more of a journey, isn't it? I want to touch on, I suppose, something that's very important to you and we haven't brought up yet, is that I suppose you don't fit the cliche of a lecturer in a university. You're a metalhead, and it's very important to you. And I suppose, I think the way in which it links to the book is a lot of writing this was very cathartic. And would you say that in terms of your love of metal music, it's something similar?
Yeah, I think that, I suppose there's a lot of ways in which I don't fit the mould of the typical university lecturer. The heavy metal is one thing, I suppose, and I do write about that, and the kind of, again, catharsis that I get from extreme music. But I think as well, and something that I perhaps have more on in the book, is that as well there's other ways in which I didn't fit the normal academic mould, so that, I was the first person in my family to go to university. My elder brother was in prison when I was at university. I, sort of got by only on scholarships because I'd come from a low-income background, and so all of these other things, which it's why Maynooth is my dream job, because Maynooth is such a great university for social inclusion and for having the highest proportion of first-generation university attenders there. It's a very special place. But I think in those ways, like that I don't come from a family of people that went to university or that are other, professors or that kind of stuff. So, there's a sense of having come from a non-traditional route, but in a way that I hope shows that, like, medieval history isn't some elite thing that's only for rich people, that it's open for everybody, it's interesting to everybody, and that if something's interesting enough to study, to devote your life to studying it, then you should, the means should be there to be able to devote your life to studying it. And gradually, governments are cutting back on scholarships and especially postgraduate funding and master's funding. So it's becoming so that only the independently wealthy can pursue advanced study, as all of the kind of supports and helping hands that were in place are being eroded. And so I think, there is the whole line of extreme metal and my interesting musical taste, but also in other ways that, anyone can go into academic research. You don't have to come from this kind of privileged background or anything like that.
I'm just opening actually the page. I had noted it where you'd written about that, and you said everything education represents to you: social mobility, changing the course of your life, perhaps outgrowing but never losing sight of your upbringing. Not just living the life an algorithm might predict for you, but truly making your own path.
Yeah, well, that was
a lovely line.
So in 2020, because I spent the lockdown in England, and in 2020, I don't remember, but the English government had come up with this algorithm to calculate A-level results for children that were leaving school, and the algorithm had built into it the previous performance of the school in previous years in calculating what students would get, and it really touched the nerve with me, because my school had been designated as a failing comprehensive, and it's been put into what was called special measures, because everyone did spectacularly badly or whatever for quite a while. But then, so if I'd been leaving school in that year, the algorithm calculated for me wouldn't have matched what I got in my A-levels, because someone can transcend the pattern the pattern comes from averages and means and medians, and there are people who can exceed that. And so the algorithm calculating what certain young people were getting was just infuriated me. But the government did end up backtracking on it, but it was still just, classism written into an algorithm.
Further on from that, on the next couple of pages, speaking of infuriating, is I think the attitude of some senior male academics towards you. You've touched on there. There's some choice language I won't read from the chapel. But I love that you've described them as these modern Zosimuses of academia, convinced of their own superiority, of the perfection of their knowledge.
Yeah.
It's been a battle.
It has been a battle at times. I think academia is hard for everybody that goes into it, to be honest. But there have been some, and especially male, I just say, senior academics who can't be as confident as they appear to be. I'm sure of it. They're so certain that they're right, but no one can be that certain that they're right, really, can they? I draw on the character of Zosimus, who's this arrogant, monk who thinks there's nothing more that he can be taught, that he knows everything, and that he's at the pinnacle of learning. But I'm not convinced. But I suspect that some of the hostility that I and other, especially when I was young, starting out, young academic, young postdoc or whatever, that some of that hostility is probably defensiveness or insecurity or something like that, I think.
And it doesn't really fit well with something you said to me before, was that you're very excited about your subject matter because there's still so much to be researched, there's still so much to be, discovered, and a lot of people might think history is, well, we know everything about history now, we're done, and it's very much not the case. So by them acting like they know everything, they're closing themselves off to new discoveries.
Absolutely.
You were very excited about.
That's what I find exciting. Yeah, I mean, the reason why the academic book took me 7 years to write was because most of the poetry that I was working with and most of the texts I was working with had never been translated into English before. Some of them had never even been edited from the manuscript that they're preserved in before. There's so much to discover about medieval Ireland. It's a really, there's so many manuscripts that are still unread and untranslated, and there's not enough people working in the field. So for me, it's all about you can discover something and it can completely transform our entire idea of what's going on in medieval Irish science or education or farming or whatever. And then you have to change your view. That's how academia works. If new evidence comes to light, you have to change your view. But some people just get, stuck, in a comfortable position, I suppose, and don't want to be challenged, I think.
There's just another lovely phrase that really jumped out to me. I really love this. You're talking about a callum. It's about nature red in tooth and claw, and for all that Finn, his men are dressed up like chivalrous knights with their deer hunting parts and musicians, yet they steal and kill. And it's very much about how everything, can look very. I think a lot of the retellings of the medieval stories that we hear in popular culture have the gloss on them and they're heroes, but really it's a lot grittier and dirtier when you get down into the weeds in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's, in my discussion at Oglav na Shnorach, the old people nattering. it gets translated like Tales of the Elders of Ireland or whatever, but it
makes
literally
it sound a lot more highbrow then.
It's literally just a conversation between old people. But anyway, Oglav na Shnorach. It's, again, the story's, the central character is Finn McCovell, who gets modernised as Finn McCool, and I think to me the stories they get some of the edges knocked off them. They get smoothed out, romanticised, turned more into sort of fairy tales or something. But the thing that annoys me more is that they also get kind of infantilised. It's like they're stories for children or something. And that, these are really complex works of literature. I mean, Oglav na Shnorach, the way it's a frame tale, episodic kind of frame tale, that stands alongside its contemporaneous Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is also frame tale, in a similar way. But Chaucer is seen as serious and grown up, but Finn McCool is seen as sort of fairy tales for children or something. And it's not. It's a sophisticated work of literature that would stand alongside other contemporaneous literatures in Europe. So I get there's a lot of the kind of violence, the complexity, a lot of the sex gets written out of these stories, and they do get sort of packaged as something nice, romantic, or childlike, or something. And that's,
But I think you've I suppose created a work that is also very complex, and we've only really just kind of scratched the surface here today, but I'm conscious that we need to leave some time for questions from the audience, so we won't even get into the sex bits. But you can read all about it. And books will be available in the bookshop downstairs on your way out, and if Elizabeth might hang around for a signing down there, that would be great as well. So I think we have a mic at the back there. If anybody wants to ask a question, we'd love to take some questions from the floor. We've one. I might just wait to get the mic up to you. Will you bring the mic from there? Oh,
Thanks very much indeed. I wanted to ask, you were talking about all that's undiscovered in the manuscript sources, but I was also thinking about how much was lost in manuscripts. I mean, to take Irish, presumably given the history of colonisation and so on, the vast amounts of manuscripts were burned, lost, thrown away, etc., from the 16th century on. So how do you kind of feel about that? Because I presume you don't actually know how much is missing. And I mean, I presume it happens as well with English, but presumably to a lesser degree.
So that's a good question, and there's two different ways of answering that. One is that, so there was the late Richard Sharp, who was a professor of medieval history at Oxford University. He wrote a great article called Irish Books 5th to 9th Century, where he tried to estimate the level of loss, using various different techniques. And he reckoned that the loss rate of medieval Irish manuscripts is probably 90 to 95%. So it's like massive amounts. Although probably a significant chunk of that would be Psalms, Psalters, biblical texts, missals, that, religious things where it wouldn't be like new texts that we don't know about or whatever. But he would, estimate over 90% of the books created in medieval Ireland would be lost. But the other way to think about it as well is that actually Ireland did continue to have a very, very vibrant manuscript copying tradition right up into the 19th century, and you can find incredibly old material in quite young manuscripts. And the most sort of apposite example, I suppose, given that I read a bit of the poetry of Blasfuck, son of Cúbreatháin, the poem about the crucifixion, it was discovered, its only copy was discovered in a modern manuscript, 16th, 17th century manuscript that's in the National Library of Ireland, but the language is definitely, 800 years older than the surviving physical copy. So the continuation of the manuscript tradition into the modern era has preserved some things that would otherwise have been lost. So that's the hopeful answer, that the massive percentage of destruction is the less positive side of that. Yeah.
We had a question. This lady here at the front. Wait.
Just on the word, you started out talking about curiosity, and you're curious, to see whether your own life journey could be extrapolated, if there was a parallel, or at least a way to link in with medieval stories and perhaps bring in or explicate some of your own journey. I was just wondering, is there such a thing or a difference between like a medieval psychology and stuff and a modern psychology? And also I was thinking you talked about the woman who had these voracious desires and she became an ascetic nun, and I was thinking, well, is that eros? And are there any sort of emotional experiences within the way the medieval configured their own life story made meaning that was different to our experience?
Thanks. Yeah, another really great question. So one of the problems for me really is that if we let's stick with medieval Ireland, there are cultural differences in other societies, but to stick with medieval Ireland, all of the medieval texts are by definition public writing. We don't have private writing. So we don't have sort of diaries or the kinds of things where you would confide your inner thought. Every writing is a public statement and generally a communal activity done in monastic scriptoria and so on. So in that sense, you don't necessarily get a window into people's inner life, and you have to take what they're saying externally, which sometimes might be might be performative or whatever, So there is I would say probably impossible to really get inside the inner psychology of a medieval person. But that being said, some of the poetry on grief, for example, does, it expresses things that we ourselves certainly feel when we feel grief today, that suggests that they're still experiencing the same emotions. We just have all that survives is the public statement of those emotions rather than necessarily the private experience. And so, yeah, I think this is
the journey, the sense of journey increasing, and the literature, the types of stories that they told, they're not so much a model sense of psychology, but a sense of making sense of the world through these stories.
Absolutely, yeah. There's one of my favourite that I write about actually is the voyage of Muldoon, who he, goes on the voyage in which he learns that he needs to forgive the man who killed his father. That kind of, well, we still talk about going on a voyage metaphorically, when we get from one state of emotion to another. So I think, I hope I am effective in drawing out where there are points of comparison. But as I say, you can only hypothesize because you're not really getting a direct window into someone's mind, which is, that barrier, I think. But,
I think there's a gentleman in the second row there.
I just wanted to pick up on something you said about revisionism and history, and accepting that historical events can be told in different ways. We seem to live in an era when even fairly recent events are told in a totally different way depending on people's political ideology in particular. I'm just wondering, from your work, is this something that's unique to our times, or does it happen in medieval times? And if it did, how do we deal with it?
In medieval history writing, when they are writing history in the Middle Ages, it's very deliberately as kind of moral example and as deeds to be imitated or deeds to be celebrated and used as modes for behaviour yourself. So here is my account of King David, and this is how kings should act. That kind of history as moral example, whatever, which is not how we would read history now. But yes, of course, people are always subject to different kind of biases and political stances, and you can definitely see that in medieval history writing as well. But I think there's, I tried to give examples in the book of history where you can have two valid but different interpretations of the same historical event, and both interpretations can be based on evidence and be plausible and be arguable, and then instances where you're just lying. That's not history. Okay, so kind of I use the example of Holocaust denial because that's the most sort of obvious one that people are familiar with, of something that is a lie. That's not an alternative view of history, it's just a lie. But then you can talk about, why did the Holocaust happen? There are multiple valid evidence-based arguments that you could use to say maybe one factor was more important than another. So I think differentiating between alternate views and views that might change because society is changing and it's opening us to thinking, oh, maybe this is actually a factor in how people behave or whatever, that's valid. And the kind of alternative facts of Trump et al. is that's not history. That's not history. Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. Oh, maybe the front here with the mic. Front right here. Thank you.
You mentioned that you disliked Queen Maeve, right? And I was just wondering, I'm assuming, and possibly I'm wrong, that it was written, her stories were written by a male, a monk, or something of that person of that nature. So could we assume that there was a little bit of misogyny in the writing? Because it would have been, I am assuming, unusual for a woman to be leading an army or whatever.
Yeah. There's without a doubt, the Peinbuchlinger is a very misogynistic text. And from our named and identifiable authors from medieval Ireland, 97% are men and 3% are women. So chances are that we don't know who the author of Peinbuchlinger is, but the chances are it's a man. Yeah. And absolutely, we have no evidence in the pre-Norman period at all of any woman ever leading an army. So, he's clearly, assuming the author is male, clearly creating an implausible and unlikely situation in the eyes of his audience. But yeah, it's a text absolutely shot through with misogyny, it really is. And actually the 12th century version is even worse, really. But we can't say 100% for sure that the author's male, but even if they're not, they're operating within a very misogynistic society. Anyway, they're shaped by misogyny around them. But yeah, the chances are the author is a man. And
just one last thing. Is there anything from medieval life or medieval society that was lost that you would like to see in modern times? That we've lost something there through the centuries that you would like to see happening in modern day life?
No. I like hot showers, Wi-Fi. I don't want to go back to the Middle Ages.
Are there any more questions? Oh, no. Okay.
I'd like to know who or what experience led you into medieval historical readings in academia.
Going to give away something that's in the book. Spoiler alert. Okay. I went to Glasgow University to do an arts degree, which was already a disappointment to my dad when it was clear that I was going to be the first one to go to university. Obviously, he wanted me to go and be a doctor or something, but I was like, I don't really know what I want to do, but I'm going to do an arts degree. I think I want to do maybe philosophy. I was thinking maybe I might sign up for history. Wasn't sure. But in Freshers Week, I saw this really hot guy. He was really sexy. I know. Yeah, he was just really hot, long hair and tattoos and piercings and stuff. And so I found out what he was doing. He'd signed up for Celtic Studies. I was like, well, I don't know what that is. That sounds good. I'll sign up for that, be in his class. And I think he dropped out definitely in the first semester. But 25 years later, here I am still doing it. So.
I saw that lady back there, blonde lady there. I'm going to take one more question. I think we're probably running way over time, but it's been a delight.
Hello. You can tell I'm not from here. We're visiting and we're really happy to be here at this festival. But what I wanted to ask you was about your move. Okay, I think moving is a catalyst for, things in your life, and you made this big jump. And I'm wondering how that's kind of changing you now and how you see your life going forward?
Life's going good.
But are you interested in anything else? I mean, it's like, now that you're in a place where, like, this is your heart, this is where kind of you're really in touch with everything you want to be, what are your ambitions from here? What are your appetites now?
My ambition is to have a relationship that lasts more than 5 minutes. And I'm working on it. But unfortunately, being me, can't be straightforward, I picked a guy that lives in America. So I get more flights, more long-distance travel, whatever.
Well, good. I'm glad you overcame your fear.
Invite me back in a year's time and I'll let you know if I'm still with it.
Quick one, go on.
I'm just wondering if you've had any opportunity to give your attention to the Brehon laws and their place in how people live their lives in medieval Ireland. And I guess the reason I mention it is because, as far as I know, in the Brehon laws, their attitude to marriage was that it didn't have to be an enduring contract, and you could actually divorce your husband after a year, or either party could by saying, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee. So anyway, I'm just wondering if the Brehon laws in particular is something that...
Yeah, I refer to it in the book just as early Irish law. I don't really like the term Brehon. Brehon is a bastardisation of the word Brithavan, which is the judge, and it sort of then implies that it's judge-centred law rather than king-centred law, which it's not. Anyway, I won't bore you with that. I have one of my PhD students is actually doing her PhD thesis on paternity and legitimacy in marriage law, and the problem is that we have a law on marriage, it deals with the distribution of property after a marriage separation, and we also have a fragmentary text, Bressa from Maclechter, which talks about the legitimacy of children born in different, whether you're actually married to the person that you have the child with or whether they're illegitimate, basically, and so on. And I think part of the problem is that the Maclechter text is only fragmentary and it doesn't survive in its entirety, and it's never been translated before, so this PhD student of mine is working on translating the text and so on. So I think we have an evolving idea of what early Irish marriage law was like and what contracts were like. But yeah, it's very contract-based, and divorce seems to have been relatively easier for men than for women, but there were situations in which both parties can divorce. But it's a really exciting area where there's new discoveries being made. Literally last night in Dublin, a new edition and translation of Bressa Covidsketter was published and launched by Thomas Charles Edwards, which is the laws of neighbourhood and of people who have adjoining land properties. So it's a law text from the late 7th century on that. So it's our understanding of early Irish law is changing all the time. It's a really dynamic.
There's lots more work to be done.
Yeah, loads more to be done. Loads of texts there that haven't been translated as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I'm afraid we will have to wind it up there.